listening to Who's Tom and Dick, a weekly podcast with your hosts, Martin Weavers, fighting stage 4 lung cancer, and Patrick Mortimer, living with heart disease. Why not grab yourself a cup of coffee, sit back, and enjoy the chatter as we discuss and share information, talking about tough subjects, and offering help, support, and motivation with a positive mental attitude.
Hi, Patrick. How you doing?
Hi, Martin. Very well, thank you very much.
Good, lovely day again.
I'm sitting in an amazing structure here.
I know.
A 18th...
My garden shed. It's an amazing structure.
Yeah. 18th or 17th century barn, is it?
Yeah.
Well, we're joined by a very special guest anyway.
We are, and it's not very often that we sort of come in the heart of Suffolk, where we live, and find a celebrity, is it, really?
No.
We normally have to travel miles and miles, but today we've got Griff Rhys Jones. Good morning, Griff.
Good morning, Griff.
Good morning to you both. Isn't it great? What's taking you so long?
Getting through your gates.
Me, I think, isn't it? I think you've been trying to do this for the last year or so, at least. Anyway, I'm glad you finally made it.
And thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, and coming on the podcast. So please, Griff, take us back to the beginning. We believe you started off in BBC Radio. So
Almost well before that, I started in Footlights.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, Cambridge.
Yeah.
And I arrived at the university, and in those days, we had pigeonholes, and they were sort of things in which people stuffed. And there were lots of invitations to join the Christian Union and things like that. And amongst them, do you know, when I go back to my college, I have to fight the urge to go up the stairs to see if anybody's put something in my pigeon.
Is it still there?
I don't think they got them anymore.
Oh, right.
But anyway, I go to the pigeonhole, and there's a note from my school chum, Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah.
And Douglas said, "Do you want to be in a play?" And there was a play going on called The Rivals, and somebody who'd been playing the part had dropped out. You know, there was a lot of that in Cambridge, because at some point, somebody's tutor would say to them, "If you're in this play," in the most charming way, because there was no sort of thing, you know, by all means, you know, be in the play, but of course you can't come back here if you are.
All right.
We thought you ought to do some work this year. And so it was all very, you know, you were treated like an adult, but I was just wet behind the ears. I arrived, and there I was in a play with Sue Lim, who's a writer on Radio 4, and so I did that. They said, "Would you come and audition to be in the Footlights?" So this was very rare for me.
Yeah.
I was very lucky in a funny sort of way. I knew enough people by then, and passed the audition, and I was in the Footlights review in my first year. Usually you did 3 years of sort of, you know, appearing on the stage, but it was a very good system because there was no adults in charge of it, not a single grown up in the room. So it was like the Trump administration. You know, it was like what happened was there was nobody to tell anybody what to do except the person who was sort of in charge at that time, who would always be an undergraduate. Yeah. And so they were there just like Trump for 3 years, and then they were booted out. So and then somebody else took over, but there was no senior figure. That's all I've felt against drama schools. You know, you need drama schools. There's always somebody in charge who says you're good. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Or you're good. In this environment, you had to prove you're good. So it was just they had a thing called a smoker, and you stood up and you told jokes, or you did whatever you could, monologues, sketches with friends and things like that. And when I was there, John Lloyd was in that first review with me. And I don't know if you've heard of John. Do you know John Lloyd?
No.
All right. So John was the man who put together Not That I've Got News, Spitting Image, QI, and Blackadder. So not a bad record for us. And he does a lot on the radio as well. He's got his own comedy show on the radio. He really is the Pope of comedy. You know, he's the sort of top man in comedy. Anyway, he was in that review. Clive Anderson was in the review after that. Rory McGarth and Jimmy Mulville were. He runs Hat-Trick now, which does Have I Got News for You and all the other comedy shows. So there we were. So suddenly I was doing that, and I fitted that in. That was a sort of spare time between being a sort of an actor and director. And I got a degree as well.
Right. Yeah.
I know there was something else. I knew there was something else I did.
Yeah, just a minor thing.
So what you have to imagine is that radio, light entertainment those days, was quite a big operation. It had 3 studios, three big live studios. It had a theatre. It had the Aeolian Hall in Bond Street, and it had another one at the Lower Regent Street. And these were just for doing live shows. And they were still doing, Men for the Ministry and things like that. But what had happened was that with a huge, range of amazing shows from the Ken Dodd Show, Morecambe Wise Show, and all that stuff, all the producers had signed on after the war. Not many of them had killed Germans, but it was your war record. So you were known for, apart from the list of letters after your name, the list of letters will be A, K, C, B, D, which was all sort of, assistant head of programming, radio, light entertainment department. So people could rattle off their long titles in a series of acronyms, Anyway, I went there and I took over Charlie Chilton's office. And first of all, I was told Charlie was, he'd been a cavalry officer during the war. Oh, right, okay. Was he a radio producer as well? Yes, he was. And he had made a lot of wonderful documentaries, but particularly co-written Oh, What a Lovely War.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was quite a big cheese, and I arrived as a junior 21-year-old or whatever I was, and I had an office, and I had a secretary sitting in another office outside my office. I was a producer. That's how grand the BBC Light Entertainment Department was. And I was only appointed, to be absolutely honest, because all these guys had come up for retirement very quickly. So they started looking for other people. They didn't know where to go. Right. And they went to Edinburgh, and I'd redirected. I think the big thing was I'd redirected Douglas Adams' own review, which was about 3.5 hours long and needed a kick in the stalls. It was called a kick in the stalls, and it genuinely needed one. Yeah. So I came in and gave it a kicking and got rid of half the things. And people like Rory McGarth were in it and things like that. Anyway, we cut it right down. And Simon Brett, who was the producer there, had seen that and seen Douglas's and seen my edit and said, "Oh, we'll have him." And so I followed John Lloyd, Geoffrey Perkins, and they were starting to fill up that corridor. There's nothing in those days that the BBC liked less. Yeah. The whole department was run at that time by the former head of the military police in Gibraltar. I don't know how many Germans he killed, but obviously
nobody ever asked him.
But anyway, as you can imagine, we felt a little bit lacking in a war record. So anyway, so off we went, and we started to take it over. And so there's a program called Weekending. I started on that, and Andy Hamilton,
Andy Hamilton,
Andy Hamilton, and
Geoffrey Perkins you mentioned. Is that the guy who sadly died a couple of years ago?
It is. Yeah,
he done Benidorm.
A very dear friend of mine.
Yeah, he done Benidorm.
He did, but before he did Benidorm, he did Father Ted and all that stuff. He became head of comedy at the BBC. So one way or another, there was a little group of people who all arrived in BBC Radio and got stuck in. John Lloyd immediately started after he did Weekending. Then Geoffrey did it, then I did it. He immediately started the news quiz, which still runs. Mm-hmm. He would start the news headlines. So, I think at one point I produced the news headlines when John was on holiday, But there was a lot going on. And Douglas did Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy with Geoffrey, and off they all went.
Yeah.
And anyway, John moved to television. My job, I was given a History of the Royal Variety Show, which was, as you can imagine, having been head of the military police on Gibraltar, Con was not known for, he was a funny man. Obviously, you'd have to be funny in those circumstances, would you? But he was not known for his most imaginative radio ideas. He was a sort of administrator. But he had this idea that we should tell the history of the Royal Variety Show in 12-hour-long episodes. So that was my first job. And the only way we could think to do it was to play extracts of people, comedians and singers and things like that, but also do interviews with them. So I got the job of going off, and that was an eye-opener. That was amazing. Yeah. I interviewed Max Wall. I met Max Wall. He was doing a show at the Old Vic. I went to see Tommy Trinder. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I went to see Al Reid. Each of these encounters is worth, an entire programme in themselves. Yeah. In fact, Al Reid, amazingly, he was like me now. See what I mean? He started off, you haven't got another question in. He started off with the story of his life. And about an hour and a half later, we had one of those little tape recorders called a Ewer. We're sitting there. And about an hour and a half later, he finished. and he finished. He started the whole show by going da 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 da. He did the whole show. Hello, my name's Al Reed, and off he went. He did the whole show. He did the voices of everybody and his whole entire act. Told his whole life story. Finished. And got to the end and finished an hour and a half later. And I said, it was my job. I looked at the guy who was the researcher and he was looking at me and I knew I had to do something. So I had to say, that's great, Mr. Reed. We only need about 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
So he was so mortified. He disappeared. We were in a club. He disappeared into his club. But the one thing, and we had to, and his wife went and got him, calmed him down, brought him back, and then we did a little interview, and we were all right. But it was one of those tragedies, because what we were doing was meeting comedians, all of whom couldn't work out why they still didn't have shows.
Oh, right.
Yeah. They were in their 80s, 90s, didn't make any difference. They still thought they should be doing a show. And they couldn't, and when I arrived from the BBC, they thought this was their moment. So after that, I was a bit more careful about making sure that they understood that we were just doing a little bit in order to play some of their greatest moments, although they would spend an hour discussing what it was we were going to play. But Tommy Trinner was typical, went down to, Walter-on-Thames or somewhere like that. And there was a big, house with a lovely wrought iron gate and all that, rang the bell and the door was opened. This was so often the case by the most beautiful 6-foot girl who was sort of about an eighth of his age, probably. Anyway, lovely girl. And he'd been in Panto and she'd been in the Tiller Girls. And so that was the thing that you had to remember about comedians.
Yep.
Is they got the chance to do Panto. And when they went to do Panto, often they would meet wife number 4 in the dance troupe,
Yep.
Max Wall told a funny story about it because he had everything. He had sports cars. They had a lot of bread. They were really doing the circuits and all that. But they still stayed in all the, in the bed and breakfast in Blackpool.
Yeah.
And when they went upstairs, what you did is you met the girl who was in the, show or come round after you'd been in the pub or whatever. You gave her a piggyback upstairs so that the landlady could only hear one set of
I can't imagine Paul Daniels doing that with Debbie McGee.
No.
Well, it was a different world, and it was a fabulous world. And it was a fabulous world because at that stage, it was mostly like that whole circuit, that whole world, the variety circuit had died. This was this sort of period of transition. There were a number of clubs up north, the Bernard Manning type club, and there were a lot of comedians who played the Bernard Manning type clubs, but you never saw them on television except in the comedians. That was about it. And so there were a few famous ones like Jimmy Tarbuck and things, but a lot of comedians who didn't have a presence on television because they did 8 minutes of tight jokes. What were they supposed to do on television? So the BBC was always looking for people who could do a bit of acting. And that's why everybody from Tony Hancock to Terry Scott or whatever, they were looking for people who could hold a sitcom or a show together. And they only had BBC One and BBC Two. BBC Two had just started. And there was light entertainment, but, you had to be, it was quite a thing to get a bit of a television show, whereas now everybody's got a television show, but nobody watches them. So, so in those days, it was a sort of weird transitional time.
Yeah.
And I'd already been down. Well, the first treat for me was going down to watch Morecambe White come and do a radio version of their television show, which is just, you're sat in the front row of the old Regent Street Paris studios, which held about 200 people and was was in a basement. And, you're sitting there with 200 people watching Morecambe White, and they're sort of there because we were sitting in the front row, and it's just extraordinary.
They were our heroes as a double act.
Well, of course.
We tried to emulate some of the things they'd done, and one of our write-ups that we was eager to read, thinking they might say that something about Eric and everything, and they said we was like Reeves and Mortimer. Didn't they?
So anyway, my friends, there was a nice guy called Richard Wilson, and Richard was a jazzer, and he did a lot of programs on radio too, for jazz night and things like that, but with Philip Jones Brass Ensemble and stuff like that. And he'd been given the Frankie Howard radio show to do, and this was a big variety show. And we needed comedians. It needed comedians. It had the Max Harris, but he really wanted to do it because of the jazz. So he put together the Max Harris Jazz Orchestra, a 30-piece orchestra with jazz orchestra with fantastic soloists and things like that in it, and fantastic singers coming along to sing with this grand fantastic opportunity. And Frankie Howard was the presenter. So he recruited. Richard was a big pub man. We all were pub people in those days. The office moved to the pub at sort of midday. Because, in fact, that was when most people got in because they were going to work all through the night in the studios, So we went to the pub, and he liked Rory. Rory was a very funny bloke to be around with. And so he asked Rory and Clive to write Be Frank, the agony column of the air, where there were set up questions, and Frank would have a series of comedy replies to these. And I thought, well, I must go down and see Frankie Howard. I'd been in Panto with the Footlights and played, and obviously a lot of it was, a bit like Frank. I always thought Frank was the most consummate comedian to sort of be somebody who would talk about themselves. Yeah. Brilliant. What he's clever about doing is not telling jokes, but sort of, reacting to the idea of, now I met this woman, that sort of, it's all sort of very personal. I went down the steps, and Mavis came running toward me. Mavis was Richard's secretary, and she was one of the twin set, sort of, twin set and Pearl's secretaries of a certain age, probably. They said, Griff, good you're here, because Richard's had a nervous breakdown. I said, right, and you've got to run the program, you've got to produce the program. I said, Mavis, I've been here in the department, I'd done a lot of things by then, I've been on television already and had a radio series and all that sort of stuff, but with the Footlights and all that stuff. But I said, look, I've only been here. I've only just been given my own stopwatch. That's how new I am. Yeah. And I'm just here to look. And she said, no, you've got to produce it. I said, no, but you've been here in the department for nearly 75 years. You should produce it. She said, I couldn't do that. So anyway, I went into the box, when they're all sitting, and they'd all looking at me, all looking a bit harassed. And I said, okay, everything all right? And they said, well, Richard's, having a difficult time. I said, right, okay, all right. Well, never mind. I'm here and I'll do what I can. What shall I do? And they said, you better go and tell Mr. Howard. So I went down the corridor. So there was a funny little dressing room called the Narrator's Suite. And I went and knocked on. I remember it so well. Just such a funny little, it was like being in a ship because it was all mahogany down below. And I knocked on this beautiful door and voice started, yes, who is it? And I said, oh, Mr. Howard. I wonder if I could have. I'm the new producer. Just a minute. Hang on. Hold on. And sort of pause, and the door was open, and there was Frank. He was wearing a pair of gold boxer shorts and a sort of shirt, sort of half undone, and what we came to call Wiggy the Red Squirrel was sort of a little bit all over one side. And he said, oh, what do you want? And I said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, Mr. Howard, I am the new producer. What do you mean, the new producer? I said, I've been appointed to produce the show. She said, what happened to the old one? And I said, well, unfortunately, he's had to go to hospital. And Frank looked at me and said, well, I hope nobody thinks it's got anything to do with me. And I said, nobody, no. So I went on, he went on, in fact, and started the show up. And the monologues were written by Marks and Gran, Murray and Laurie. Mm-hmm. Who I saw Morris just the other day, and with a friend, staying with a friend up in that thing, and then we started a sort of 2-year relationship where we did this show, and Frank was both incredibly funny, fantastically naughty, and a complete and utter pain in the arse. And he was just so funny because he'd ring me up. He'd not looked at the script until about 3 a.m, after he and Dennis, his man, had his partner, had sort of drunk themselves, he'd ring me 3 a.m. Say, well, I'll just be reading the script. And I said, right, okay, Frank, it's 3 a.m. He'd say, yes, it's horrible. It's no good. It's terrible. I want it all changed. So I'd say, well, I can't get anybody to do it. But as soon as they come in the morning, I have to say, it was written by Rory and Jimmy then. And I have to say, they got pissed off with this, you see. Marks and Grant, everybody did, because Frank would rewrite everything so much and not want to do it. Do you know what I mean? That nobody would do it.
Right.
It was a nightmare for a producer.
Yep.
They wouldn't produce a script because they produced a sort of rough script, knowing that Frank would sort of sit round and sort of massacre it and start anyway. So we had it wasn't his finest hour, I'm sorry to say. Although some of the people we had on were absolutely amazing, like the Delta Rhythm Boys and God knows what, and fantastic jazz. But the first night was very typical, and he'd done his monologue, and then then the music had played and all that. The band had been fantastic, and then the first comedian had come on, and then there was a long pause, and I'm sitting in the box, I'm going like this, looking at the stage, and the announcer came up and said, "Hello, ladies and gentlemen, will you welcome Mr. Frankie Howard?" No Frank, you see. I turn round and I look at all the other people sitting, all the technicians sitting in the box, and they're all staring at me like this. And I go, okay. I run off down the corridor again to find Frank. And I said, I knocked on the door. Yes? Oh, is it? Oh, Mr. Howard. Hello, it's me, the producer. Just a minute. Hang on. Oh, just a minute. Oh, he's in the gold boxer shorts again. I said, well, it's just you've just been announced. Yes, I think I need a rest. I'll be there in 5 minutes. So I said, oh, all right. So we didn't have anything to do. We didn't have a warm-up man.
Yep.
The producer had to be the warm-up man. So I suddenly realised that I'd have to go, but I hadn't got anything prepared or anything. I didn't know I didn't tell jokes. I didn't, so yep. I went to Max and I said, could you just play some music? He said, this is a 30-piece orchestra. We don't improvise. So I said, well, I wonder if you could just play the Frankie Howard theme tune. Yeah. So they played the Frankie Howard theme tune while we tried to stop the audience getting up and leaving, He came back home. We discovered afterwards he hated the comedians. Well, they just do their act. I don't want them to come in here and do their act, if I want to, and we do, and the whole thing was, but the trouble was that he didn't like them coming and doing a chunk of their act, which was polished and good. Well, I have to do this new stuff. And so, it was, and the funny thing is, I sort of sympathise with him because I know this position I've been in it myself, you've been hugely successful and then you're suddenly doing something and you think, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Well, this isn't going to put me back where I was. Do you know what I mean? And he was in one of his, and the funny thing about Frank is he'd had that great hit. He'd been a young, hugely energetic comedian when you see him doing that stuff. Fantastic, these sort of powerful stuff. And then it all faded off. He's the first person to play Stolmos Circuit, on his own, really, as a comedian, without having a great show around him. He'd go and keep the audience going and then it all faded away and he decided to go and open a pub and then he had a monologue written for him. And this is what he always used to say by Galton and Simpson, Marty Feldman, Eric Sykes.
Wow.
All people who were part of that extraordinary Beryl Virtue sort of stable, Spike Milligan, they all contributed jokes to this monologue he did for the Establishment Club, and there's records of it, and it's an amazing, my government have no choice but to declare war on Germany. Just stupid, isn't it? There's only 14 of them in the government. Why do they do that? It was full of great gags like that, really good gags. And then that faded, and then he did a whole series on the BBC where he just used to sit on that stool. Do you remember that, written by Galton and Simpson, where he'd do all that? That was brilliant. And just like Tony Hancock, he sort of fell out with Galton and Simpson, and then he faded away, and then he came back, did a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, and then did Up Pompeii, and then he met me.
Because he used to do a little monologue at the start of Up Pompeii, didn't he, as well?
Yeah.
To every show and all that.
Yes, yeah. But anyway, so it was just sort of like my beginning was to meet, and then I did a show with Alfred Marks and David Jason, and Miriam Margulies and all those people. So all these people that I worked with over the years, it was funny. And then John Lloyd went off to do Not the 9 O'Clock News, and I used to keep performing with a thing called An Evening Without.
Mm-hmm.
And we do it in theatres like the Arts Theatre, Cambridge, but on a Sunday. And this was with Clive Anderson and Jimmy Marvel and Rory McGarth and sometimes Emma Thompson. And we do a load of old sketches and things like that.
Yeah.
And that was because there was no circuit.
Right.
People find this really hard to believe.
Yeah.
Mm.
But there was no, you couldn't take a show anywhere except to a theatre and try and persuade them to either put it on late night, which we also did, week in some theatres, really late at night after their show had finished. But there were no clubs, there was nowhere for sort of young comedians to go.
Yeah.
And so I was doing that at the Arts in Cambridge, and I was on the train back with John Lloyd, and he said, well, when we do Not the 9 O'Clock News, you were very funny tonight and you must come and do Not the 9 O'Clock News. So I said, oh, all right. So obviously I held him to that.
Yeah.
I don't know that I did actually, but so I was suddenly working in the radio and using all this vacation, which I'd never claimed any vacation because I was working so hard. So I took all my vacation to make Not the 9 O'Clock News. The BBC Radio and I still somehow, we sort of assumed they talked to each other. They didn't. They hated each other. So there was nothing in radio that wanted to have anything to do with television. And television wouldn't have anything to do with taking stuff from radio unless they actually left radio and went to them. And which is what John Lloyd did. Mm-hmm. He left radio in a bit of a bait because he'd written him out of Hitchhikers. And I mean, which he was writing with Douglas. And Douglas then said, I want to write this on my own or something anyway. So John had a little bit of a thing and left and went off to television. And they said, oh, hello, Mr. Lloyd. We were wondering when you were going to come to us. And it was not, we'll come to you and recruit you. It was, we like everything you've done in radio and we'd like to work with you. So here's a £5. Go and have a curry with Sean Hardy and come up with an idea and come back and see us. And that's what they did and came back with Not the 9 O'Clock News, and it sort of developed from there. And I went to see, after 3 series, I went to see 3 series, 2 series, I can't remember. I went to see David Hatch and said, they want me to go on doing Not the 9 O'Clock News, but I've used up all my vacation now and I can't do it. Mm. He said, right, so? And I said, I've got to take unpaid leave or something, or I've got to sort of leave BBC.
Yeah.
And he said, righto. And I said, well, I suppose, I'd better leave. All right, honey bun, don't come back here looking for a job, will you? Oh, okay. So I left because Not the 9 O'Clock News become like a sort of rock and roll, really. Mm-hmm. It was a program which directly appealed to young people, and it was a bit of an eye-opener. It's the era of The Good Life and Mike Yarwood, the 2 Ronnies, but everything was very middle-aged, and all the programs that were made, even some Money to Do Avon or anything like that, some brilliant comedy, but it was all sort of middle-aged. It was made by middle-aged people.
Yeah.
And it was all aimed at a sort of the middle England, and very funny. A lot of it, really brilliant stuff. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But very middle-aged. So suddenly they did a show, Not the 9 O'Clock News, which was like a release valve, because John Lloyd had been working in radio, like me, and there were loads and loads of writers writing in radio, because we'd come young people to work in radio. We brought with us lots of great writers. We brought in Rory and Jimmy and people like that, and they'd all started writing for the radio. Great people like Rory Rowley, who'd been a plumber in Leeds, Laurie, and he used to start writing the jokes for the back pages of Punch, where you had to write your own caption. He won it so often, he thought, well, I'm quite good at writing these jokes. I'll try writing some for the radio. So he did. So he started writing one-liners. And the thing was that the radio, this is what I always believed as a producer, is that if you want to be successful as a sort of an outlet, you have to have 1 or 2 freelance shows. You can't just have a slush pile and have just reading the slush pile. Who knows? People send stuff in, and that's how they do it to a large extent, and agents suggest things. But much better to have freelance shows like Weekending, News Headlines, the News Quiz, lots of little gaps which people who are funny can send stuff in, and then you start to identify them.
Mm-hmm.
So Not the 9 O'Clock News was a freelance show, and The Two Ronnies was largely written by a little group of writers, very, 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 very good writers, but they were like a little... Ronnie wrote quite a lot himself, Joe Wiley. And then there was a bunch of Nobsy, Dobsy, Robsy or whatever, all those guys who'd written the Frost Show and all that stuff. But Not the 9 O'Clock News set up and said, look at all these new writers, Colin Bostock Smith, all those people. Some of the greatest sketches that Not the 9 O'Clock News ever did were written by Colin, to just gobble the month and stuff like that. It was a bit like the beginning. That was the week that was the same, It allowed everybody to write who'd never written comedy before or had written comedy successful, get to the television at last.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we were doing Not the 9 O'Clock News, the thing you remember most of all, was sitting down and reading the sketches which were proposed for the show, that they were so good that we'd have to go, these are all fantastic. And he'd say, and we're going to have to lose at least half of them. Fantastic sketches, fantastic material poured in. You watch Not the 9 O'Clock News now still, and it's just like the hit rate is incredible. There's never a dull sketch in it or a bad quickie. It's all just fantastically funny.
Yeah.
And except for the first series. Now, what happened in the first series was, and I won't go into it too much detail, but there was a little bit, John had made a pilot which hadn't worked, and he'd done that with actors. And he realised that he needed people who wanted to work through material, like if you're doing a comedy show. That's why the BBC had traditionally, unless it had very strong writers like Jonathan Lynn, it had traditionally used comedians because they worked through material. Do you know what I mean? They had a survival instinct. That's what bringing people in from Edinburgh was about at that time, Edinburgh Review. Do you know what I mean? Was these people at least have stood in front of an audience and known what it's like if they're not laughing.
Yeah. And
when you first arrive as a producer in radio, you're presented with all these scripts with people who earnestly tell you they're the funniest thing, that there's ever been written, and all they need is their opportunity to get their show on television, and your producer looking at them and going, yeah, I understand. Why is it funny? It doesn't make anybody laugh. It's just like, it's sort of like, it's what you think is, and they'd start by telling how terrible comedy was and how everything, and you have to go, yeah, right, okay. But, and it needs this thing. But what the instinct of knowing that you're getting stuff from people who have actually tried it out themselves, been up there, done some stuff. So one of the first things we did when we all arrived at, the BBC was start a little club like the Footlights. Do you know what I mean? Above a pub. We started comedy sketch place. And when I think now of the number of places where people go and do things above pubs, things like that, the idea that there was nowhere in London in the 1970s until we started it.
Yeah, cracky.
So shortly after that, the Comedy Store started, and we couldn't go to the first night because I think we were all at the races, but we went to the second night of the opening of the Comedy Store and did some stuff there. Not hugely successfully. Alexi Sale and people like that was there. But, we weren't hugely successful because we did sort of sketch stuff and it didn't really suit the Comedy Store. But when you went to Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Fringe, there was the Footlights, did a late night comedy thing. The Oxford Review Company did a late night comedy thing, and Bristol Reunions were there. There were 3 theatres.
Yeah.
Last year, there were 6,000 comedians at the Edinburgh Fringe. No wonder they all the people who were in those shows just found a way into because there was, we didn't really deserve it, but there was no competition. Although it'd been a competition to get into the things we did, but the same thing was trying to find people to write things and, do that. That's all the business. Because television, radio in particular, although they don't do it anymore, they don't do nearly as much written stuff, but written written stuff, they're voracious. It gobbled it up.
Yeah.
Gobbled it up.
Yeah.
So had you known many of the cast had you known Rowan before and Mel?
My final year when I we were involved with for about 5 years, which was about 5 years longer than most people. 1 year is what people usually do. But and I saw Rowan, Anne, who'd been in one of the footlights, had gone to do a PhD or something like that, or a master's at Oxford, and she said she came rushing into us when we were all in the changing room. We're all very cynical young men, callow young men, and said, "Oh, you must come and see this wonderful, there's this wonderful new comedian called Rowan who's appearing at the with the Oxford Review." We were sharing a hall by that stage with the Oxford Review. We said, "Oh, I don't know if we need to do that, but thanks for the advice." But we went and watched him, and obviously I never knew him very well, but I produced his first radio series called The Atkinson People, so I had met him. Yeah, and Mel had been in review in Oxford in my first year, and I hadn't met him. I'd seen him in a pub.
Yeah.
Somebody pointed him out to me, and that was about the limit of the involvement. But anyway, so it was an interesting. I mean, the thing about Not Iconic News was it was like a floodgate opening, because television was just on the brink of going to Channel 4, and they sort of realised, almost like producers started thinking, younger producers started thinking, there's an enormous audience out there, an overexcited audience. I mean, Not Iconic News put its stuff on record because there was no videos.
Yeah.
So it used to go on an album.
Right.
And those albums went straight to the top of the album charts.
Yeah.
Things like that. And the books that John Lloyd. So the merch suddenly was huge, and that's, thank God, because actually the pay was rubbish. Equity minimum,
Yeah.
But what had happened in the first show, in the first series, was that there'd been a sort of tension, because John wanted to produce something which was joke orientated, if you like. Not necessarily gag orientated, but sort of like he had done a lot of fast moving radio shows and things like that, and had that sort of philosophy. And the inclination from one of the cast members was slightly to do much longer and slightly more involved. What alternative? There was a lot of alternativeness knocking around. This was before alternative comedy, but alternative London, and there was a sort of hip them and us feeling to society. We were all on the verge of that, but John wanted, and so they fell out, and Chris went, and I was pulled in to play a bigger role than I had in the first. I was definitely in the first series and did a lot of sketches and stuff like that. But what really happened was that Chris Langham left, and there we were left with four of us, and I was, I think, seen as a colleague for John. Do you see what I mean? Because I was also coming from exactly that same world, and I knew all those writers, and I also had a sort of more of a sort of gag orientated thing. Right. So I found an old diary, and my job principally was to keep, in those early rehearsals, was to keep a record of all the jokes that came up during the thing, and then write up a version, and then write up another version for John, and So I became a sort of assistant, in a funny sort of way, assistant producer to the structure and the process, which I think John found an ally in me, for a certain type of comedy. There's no doubt the second series, Not Iconic News, was much tighter, faster, and banging than the first series, which had been interesting, because the other thing that was really interesting was the way that Mel established a different style of performance for the series. Because I remember when the first series came out, the critic of The Independent said something like, "If these wankers," and so you're not getting across, are you? If the review starts, "If these wankers," it's sort of, But what Mel did in this era, where the thing had been that Python had come along, and this was some years on, of course, from the end of Python, but there was a sort of feeling that Python had been so absurd, so amazing, so world conquering, that nobody could ever do a sketch show again.
Yeah.
Absolutely seriously thought that was the end of that was the last word in sketches. And anybody who did a sketch show tried to be like Monty Python.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They tried to imitate Monty Python. So we hadn't been doing that in the radio. We've been doing topical stuff. And we hadn't, and you don't do topical stuff in a sort of totally crazy, silly way. You have to be a bit more pointed. You have to be grounded a bit more.
Yeah.
And then Mel used to perform in a very laid back way. He was an actor, he'd been in films and already by then. And so his approach to acting in Not the Icon News was to play it completely straight. And bizarrely straight, because in those days, people would come on, and if they were in a sketch, they'd be very easily. And it's not that we couldn't do the occasional sketch like that, but Mel was often, you think of Gerald the Gorilla and Mel playing the part in that, which is the sort of slightly miffed trainer. He's not doing it in a funny wig with great big glasses or anything like that. He's doing it just as a bloke who you can imagine was a trainer.
Yeah.
and Rowan was seen as the sort of slightly, unbelievably quirky. And for me, my story up to then was comedian who came on, did a lot of falling around and being what I would call, what people charmingly called the grotesque. And it was quite weird that I became the straightest man when you compared me with Mel Smith, with Rowan Atkinson, and with Pamela Stevens. I was the straight person, which that wasn't true otherwise. Anyway, so Not the Icon News was a sort of baptism of extraordinariness because it was like being in rock and roll, Did
you do it in theatres at all?
Yeah, we did it at the Drury Lane.
Yeah.
What sort of boundaries did you have? Because obviously we got this politically correctness now.
Yeah.
Which is suppressing comedy, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think going back, we laughed at gays.
Yeah.
Not offensively, but it was a sort of thing. And it was dressing up as women. That was sort of, there was a program about the 70s comedy just last night I was watching. And every single one of them, Stanley Baxter, they all, there was Dekemery, you name it, they're all just coming on dressed as women. That was Les Dawson, every single sketch, they were dressed as a woman. And you thought, well, I suppose when we didn't have enough women, I was dressed up as a woman. So I was the other singer in ABBA and things like that. But we had Pamela, so it wasn't very often. But it was always a bit more, how can I put this? A bit more trans. I was expected to be like a Vincent woman, not a Les Dawson or a Monty Python woman or even a Dekemery woman, but more a Stanley Baxter woman. Do you know what I mean? If you should have been.
Yep.
Anyway, so there was a lot of that. And but the main things were sort of, it wasn't really that topical. That's the other thing that's really important. It was a weekly show, so it would had news stories and things like that in it. It wasn't, there was a lot of topical writing in it, but actually a lot of the sketches were generalities, about things that were going on at the moment, making jokes about new things like blow heaters in urinals. John loved to go to the toilet. There was a lot of toilet stuff. And the funny thing is, it's also interesting how it's not repeated.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's so topical that it's not. But what the reason is, because it's written by a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the BBC finds it easy to repeat things now, like the young ones. And the history of comedy is slightly being rewritten as a result of that.
Yeah.
So people say to me, "Oh, Griff, you're amazing. You're in the young ones playing Bambi, Bambi Gascoigne." I go, "Yeah, I think that was an afternoon of my life. I don't really remember much about it." But the thing is, that we were in a show which was 10 times the size of the young ones at the time.
Yeah,
absolutely massive. But the point was, it was written by so many people that the BBC have now sort of wiped it. Do you know what I mean? They don't want to get involved in paying the rights of all those people.
Yeah. And then,
in fact, they went through the millennium or some sort of thing, I think, and they built BBC Two, didn't they? They didn't even mention it, and it's just crazy because it was huge. It was huge. It was bigger than, it was 18 million people at one point.
Wow.
And that was with a difficult, edgy show. So, you're not talking about just a family favourite. You're talking about the one that the kids said, Mummy, Daddy, I want to stay up and watch. No, you can't. It's not for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a huge thing and lasted, of course, in people's memory for a long time, but it was so long ago now. I mean, we're talking, 45 years ago?
It's strange you mentioned about the pilot episode because I was watching the One Show the other night. Paul Merton was on talking about, have I got news for you?
Yeah.
And he said the pilot episode for that was rubbish.
Yeah.
And you were saying that the pilot, and then you wonder how they get commissioned after.
Well, what was faith in talent, faith in people, was stronger then. The producers had all been, generally, John Howard Davis, the heads of comedy, they'd all worked in comedy. They'd all worked as juniors in comedy. They worked as floor managers. They worked as directors. They'd all worked. Commissioners in comedy these days can be commissioners in comedy and all they've ever seen is comedy programs. So they go, why isn't this like Cheers? And you go, well, it will be.
Yeah.
But Cheers wasn't like Cheers when it started. You have to have, it's a process. It's like Geoffrey Perkins being told by the controller of the BBC, he said to him, I only want hits.
Yeah.
To which the only response is, we all only want hits, but comedy is not like that. Comedy isn't, getting into the zeitgeist, why some things work and why other things don't, And now, of course, it's much cheaper to do a show where you get 4 comedians on, where you run the gamut of hundreds of comedians coming on one after another, and they're sort of like they're panel shows, and they're like, but those What's My Line and things like that weren't expected to be a gag fest, But they found those as a process, a sort of reality comedy show. Do you know what I mean? Which is cheaper and easier to do than committing to making big comedy shows. And of course, the comedy show that I went on to do, Smith and Jones, was based around Not an Irish News in a funny sort of way. I mean, we had the same sort of structure and format, and we were fortunate to continue. I mean, I know they made a big sketch series with Pamela because they saw Pamela as being the thing, but that pilot didn't work, and they decided not to pursue it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's partly about relationships. It's partly about trust. It's partly about knowing that there's something there even when it might have not manifested itself. It's partly about this is good. We're going to go for another series and another series after that because we believe in this and it's going to go through, rather than after we did to go on, me and Graham, and we had very good fun doing it. We won a Sony for it, and we went in to talk about a third series, and the controller, the comedy person at Radio 4 said, I think it's time for somebody else to have a go.
Right.
And we went, wow. So we've made something really good, and you just want to sort of get rid of it to get something not so good in because you'd like to hear somebody else having a go. That's a really weird sort of state of affairs. But I mean, other people have had experiences much more fundamentally bothersome than that been really, really funny and made great things. And eventually, Mel and I, we did 11 series, Smith and Jones.
Mm-hmm.
We did, nearly over 30 hours of television comedy sketch shows. Some of it was very, very funny. And I look back on some of the stuff and go and surprise myself. People show me things that we did, and I go, don't remember doing that. I mean, people come up to me at parties and things like that, start talking about sketches, and I'm completely blank. I've no idea. I think sometimes they're thinking about the One Show or Monty Python or something like that. But sometimes, I mean, it's absolutely true. It's just I don't remember. It was all such a turnaround. We did it all, and I can't remember it. And yet, it's their favourite sketch ever. Whatever.
Was it your and Mel's idea to go and do this, or did the BBC ask you for another show?
John Howard Davis asked us to do a Christmas special. They were doing a Christmas special. They said, would you come in and would you do a sketch together? And I sat down and, without really thinking about it very hard, I just wrote a Christmas hospital visitor sketch where Mel was in hospital, settled in comfortably and looking forward to watching the television, had a broken leg or something like that. And the nurse kissed him goodnight, as it were, and went. And then he looks round and there's a hospital visitor arrived. And you gradually realise that it's the hospital visitor, of course, who's lonely and looking for company. I've got nobody to spend Christmas with. And it was a very simple sketch,
Yeah.
and I'm really pleased I wrote it, probably, and pleased that John Howard Davis thought this was great. So he said, why don't you make a pilot? So we did, and the pilot worked, and then off we went, and we chugged along. And
who came up with the title? Because that's a great title, copying Alias Smith and Jones.
That was John Lloyd.
Yeah.
John Lloyd said you should call it Alias Smith and I never quite went for it because I was worried that Alias Smith and Jones would finish.
Yeah.
But it did. And so people don't know what the connection was or whatever.
No.
And it sounded to me like Armitage to Fortune, but off we went. We did it. And then when we moved to BBC One, and then there's a point where I think the first series was a bit patchy, but the second, third, fourth, fifth series were really great. And we were produced by Jamie Ricks, and he was very, very efficient. And there's some wonderful, wonderful stuff. Then we moved to BBC One, and we tried to be bit more populist with John Plowman, who also became the head of comedy. And that we should have probably tried to. Everybody would say, "Why don't you do something else?" And you go, "No. We've tried every conceivable approach to sketch comedy, you know." And in fact, when we finished, I wrote with Dan Gaster and Will and Paul Powell. We wrote a thing called 3 Floors Up, which was just two guys working in a freelance sort of cartoonists. Do you know what I mean? Shared an office, me and Mel, and it was a very funny show. And at that stage, this was about 1998, somewhere like that, 1999. And I remember talking to Peter Fincham, and he said, I don't think there's any trouble here. This is just very funny, isn't it? And I said, yeah, it's a very funny sketch. It was just two blokes. And it was suddenly, we've been doing a lot of those sort of sketches, a bit more American in tone, but, you know, just continuous stuff. And they started to say things like, yes, but, you know, what else happens? And I said, well, nothing happens. It's about two people sharing a space, and you know, all the backstory will develop as we need it. You know, and so you gradually get to learn about them. And it's about, you know, one is me, bit neurotic, does all the work. He was the guy who wrote the strips. He had to work really hard writing the whole thing. And the other guy was the guy who drew them, and he enjoyed himself and drew them in about half an hour at the end of the week.
Yeah.
And so spent most of the rest of the week trying to watch things on television and just getting in the way, and while the other one was fretting about work. And it was a very simple mirror of the relationship that I had with Mel in a funny sort of way.
Yeah.
You know, like I was the one who was trying to put the show together, and Mel would turn up and say, "Where's the script?" And then they said, it's very male. And I said, well, we are. That's, you know, we are biologically male, and we are, the two of us are blokes, and we have been for quite a long time, I think.
Yeah.
So that's just the way it is. And they said, wouldn't it be better if a woman wrote it? And I said, well, no, because I write it. I write most of it. Well, can't you get a woman to help you? Well, I suppose it'd be possible. It's got to have a woman in it. So I said, well, that's not impossible either, because, of course, you know, we've just written this one. It was quite a male episode. It's a very funny thing.
Yeah.
I watched it the other day, and I took it on tour. That's why I started touring in a funny way. Well, what happened? I watched it, and simple story is, the simple story of the episode is, I've got a deadline and everything like that. Mel's got a football match. So he's got a television arrives because he wants it set up in the office. He's invited everybody, all his mates round, to come and watch the football in the afternoon. And I've got to write this. Anyway, we're sitting there, and it gets colder and colder, and we realise the central heating's gone off. So we send for a plumber, and while Mel's fiddling about trying to get a signal on the television, the plumber dies in the corner. He's underneath the... he doesn't have a part at all. He just arrives, but he's just underneath the... It's dead. And we looked all this stuff up, and we didn't know what to, do, except that we had to wait for an ambulance to take him, and all that stuff. And a doctor arrives, and it's a mate, you know, and certifies him as dead. And then we're all just sitting around. We have to go next door. Ken Campbell was in it, and he was playing the tattooist in the thing next door. We had to sit with him. Well, and all the other guys arrived to watch the football, and they're all sitting in the tattooist as well. And everybody just goes, "Oh, what the hell? Let's just go watch the football." So even though the body is still there.
Oh God! And what was this called?
It was called 2 Floors Up. So I went away and rewrote another very good episode. And we had lots and lots of ideas for the way that this thing would develop. And when we came back, they said, well, the time has passed. And I said, the time hasn't passed. You passed the time. Yeah. I've been working on this, but it was the realisation that it was sort of over with the BBC. Do you see what I mean? They just... So I'm never tempted when they say, let's go back to the BBC comedy department and try and get something for you, Griff. And you go, no, they've retired me. I suppose we could have gone somewhere else with it. I don't know why we didn't. We didn't anyway. But in a way, it was a great relief to not be working on a sketch show. You know, it was quite mentally sort of... I didn't go as mad as Spike Milligan trying to write the Goon Show, but you do find you've explored avenues. There was a point, Jon Magnuson was our final producer. We worked with 3. And Jon, really great producer, but I remember we were putting together the show and he showed me a sketch and said, I think this is very funny. And I said, yeah, but we've done this. And he said, yeah, but Griff, you say that about every single sketch I put in front of you. You say, we've done something like this, or this is not a new idea. I said, no, Jon, right, in this case, this is word for word a sketch I wrote.
Right.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
For the show that somebody has just written down and sent in as if it's their own work.
Yeah.
Wow.
Some great and wonderful stories there from Griff. And Griff is so generous with his time, we've had to cut this episode into 2 parts. So we're going to show you part 2 next week on Who's Tom and Dick. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week with Griff Rhys Jones.
Bye, everybody.
Part 2. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Who's Tom and Dick podcast with your hosts, Martin Weavers and Patrick Mortimer. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite streaming platform. New episodes are available every Friday. Thanks for tuning in.